The dust may have settled in Puerto Rico after a tumultuous election season, but the fight for what comes next is just beginning. One of the biggest surprises in this year's election cycle has been the rise of independent parties. The three candidates who ran as independents won a combined 35% of the vote. So what will be the shape or makeup of the incoming government? And how much closer is Puerto Rico to becoming America's 51st state? Let's bring in Mariah Espada for more. Now, Mariah is a fact checker for Time magazine. Mariah, thank you so much for being with us. All right, let's talk about the turnout and why turnout might have been so low in this election. What was happening there?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me, Paula. So, as you know, the last century, Puerto Rico has been a territory of the U.S. And over the last decades, two parties have really dominated their political sphere. You have the new Progressive Party, and they're in favor of statehood, becoming the 51st state. You also have the Popular Democratic Party, and they are in favor of remaining in that Commonwealth status. Now, the new Progressive Party, they were the party that had the governor's seat since 2016. They're a very scandal-ridden party, and many on the island have not been satisfied with their handling of federal aid. So the state has been in a bit of a crossroads, which definitely could impact that voter turnout. You know, they had in the last 4 years back-to-back Hurricane Irma and Maria. They had devastating earthquakes, student strikes, climate crisis that's impacting them directly, a continuous fiscal debt that continues to climb. So many on the island have felt that the statehood party, as well as the two limiting parties, are playing a substantial role in their struggling. And so many have decided not to show up to the ballot box.
All right, Mariah, let's look at traditionally. What are the traditional parties in Puerto Rico, and why are younger generations, millennials, Generation Z, why are they breaking away from what historically have been the traditional parties you've seen in recent years?
Absolutely. So once again, we have those two dominating parties. You have the New Progressive Party as well as the Popular Democratic Party. What's really interesting in the case of this election is the pro-statehood party that we had mentioned previously. They did secure another 4 years with their candidate Pedro Pierluisi, who will be governor. But he actually won with the smallest margin of any governor on the island's history. So what's happening is a real shift amongst young people particularly. There were some new parties, the Citizens Movement Victory, as well as Project Dignity. These were two parties that ran on anti-corruption tickets. And when you combine the numbers of these two new parties, as well as the Independence Party, they actually combined made up the majority of the vote. So they were also able to secure some seats in Puerto Rico's Senate and House. So although they did not secure the governor's seat or the majority of the legislature, they did show there's a real appetite of new people coming and pushing outside of the usual two-party system.
So to be clear, do younger voters want and support statehood?
Now, that's another great point, Paula. So the question of statehood was also on the ballot. The pro-statehood party made sure to have that question, despite the U.S. making it very clear they would not be appropriating any funds for its execution. And so the results of that were 52% of people voted in favor of Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state. Now, many are still questioning whether that slim majority is reflective of what the island really wants. They, as we mentioned before, had a relatively low turnout with only 50% of eligible voters participating. But what's even more important to point out in this conversation of statehood was that this was a non-binding referendum. So you hear a majority of people voted for statehood with a slim majority of 52%, but you also hear it's non-binding. So what does that mean? What it means is whichever outcome, Congress is not binded to act on it. So this is actually the 6th time the island has voted on the question of statehood with no real commitment from Congress to act on it. So while this idea of what status would be best for the island is quite divisive, as you see, we have different parties wanting different things, many on the island have come together to agree that there needs to be a process that is binded by Congress, one where a congressional assembly and the island can come together and make an actual decision on the island's status.
But so the rise of independent parties, then you have, of course, the existing political structure. It sounds like they are on track for a pretty significant political crash.
Absolutely, Paula. And when you talk to people on the island, you hear them. They say, "Solo el pueblo salva el pueblo." Only the people save the people. A lot of Puerto Ricans on the island are losing faith on what government can do for them. And so you're seeing a lot of young people, again, get fired up. We see on the US side how a lot of the youth electorate played such a vital role in this year's presidential election. And we're seeing that same momentum of youth playing out in Puerto Rico. Not only are they interested in getting in the advocacy route of everything, but they're interested in getting involved politically and showing up to the ballot box in that way.
So only a slight majority of Puerto Ricans voted for the longstanding issue of statehood, but it wasn't binding. So what happens next?
Another great question, Paula. So it's no surprise that GOP congressmen are not interested in Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state. Many of them fear that this would add additional blue seats that would most benefit Democrats. So there are also Democratic representatives that are pushing to introduce bipartisan resolutions that will support the referendum results. There's also some Boricuas in Congress, including Representative Nidia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They proposed the Puerto Rico Self-Determination Act. Now, what this would do is it reaches a little bit more of that process that we were talking about earlier, where it would start negotiations between Congress and a body of representatives that would come to a decision that's binded. And unfortunately, that current bill is in a bit of a limbo, and it has yet to reach the House floor. But again, this is long term, what we're seeing here. Young people are getting fired up, and although they didn't necessarily, again, take the seat of the governor or the legislator, the momentum continues to build. So the future of Puerto Rico is certainly in the hands of young people.
Well, Mariah Espada, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your great reporting.
Thank you so much, Paula.